So the purpose of this workshop is to teach you the basics of science communication. It's kind of like a trailer to a movie or an appetizer before the main meal. Because this is only an intro to SciComm, I won't be going too much depth into everything, but it's more so to help you understand where you may need to later fill those knowledge gaps and pursue those resources. So let's get started. I just want to say a disclaimer that my views do not represent the Science Writers and Communicators of Canada or the Chemical Institute of Canada. So before we start, I'm going to start with defining science communication. Ironically, my peers and I found the definition of SciComm quite elusive. It varies between academics as well as SciComm practitioners. So after stewing about the definition over a year, I define science communication as an interdisciplinary field that involves making science accessible to different audiences. Sorry, I'm going to answer all questions at the end, sorry. So let me break that down for you. When I say interdisciplinary, it's because science communication as a field draws a lot of research and practices from all different fields, including psychology, education, sociology, politics, science, art, rhetoric, and there's so much more. And it's also an academic field that you can pursue research in. A lot of the research coming out of SciComm right now has to do with misinformation as well as how empathy helps with debunking myths. And the second part of this is making science accessible to different audiences. But what do I mean by that? Well, many people immediately assume SciComm is about the science community talking to the public. And you're right, that's absolutely a big part of SciComm. But if you think of it a little bigger than that, you have to consider how there are different stakeholders within science communication. There are scientists, government, public, media. So SciComm can be anything from scientists to talking to other scientists, government talking to the public, media, and talking to the government and scientists. So it's important to forget that SciComm isn't something that's just exclusive to the scientists communicating with the general public. But before we do dive into the best practices of SciComm, I would like to take this opportunity to give you a brief history of SciComm. So prior to the 18th century, science wasn't something that was accessible to the public, nor was it funded by the government. I know the horror. Science was something that was exclusive to those who had patronage or were part of science societies. Now, when we come to the 1800s, industrialization, such as the conveyor belt, steam locomotive, steam-powered printing press, and the growth of the middle class motivated universities and public institutions to fund technological research as well as scientific research. So with the power of the printing press and social reforms that focused on the working class, there were more efforts that were invested into science literacy for all socioeconomic classes. And that was done through weekly periodicals, books, public lectures. And one of these famous examples is the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, which are held. And those are public lectures that famous scientists would give and deliver that was intended for a general audience in an informative and entertaining way. Now that brings us to the 1900s, and I know we had a couple people from North America, so I was like, oh, thank God, my references will still make sense. Public engagement came a lot later in North America, and that came in the form of STEM education. And what happened was that the US lost the space race when Russia launched Sputnik before them in 1957. What followed 2 years later were tremendous efforts into informal STEM education. And for the Canadian context, about a couple more years later, they built the Ontario Science Centre in 1969. So for North America specifically, the space race was a catalyst for science literacy and engagement. And that brings us to the last 2 decades. SciComm has really taken off in a variety of mediums, such as blogs, science centers, outreach, videos, YouTube, podcasts, social media, and so forth. And the reason why I do a little brief history is to kind of emphasize that SciComm may seem like a new thing because the hashtag SciComm has become such a big thing on Twitter and on social media. And while it may be still a relatively younger field than something like biology, it's been around a lot longer than we think. Regardless, this new boom in SciComm is very exciting. So let's get into the meat of my session. Today I'm going to be covering some best practices for evidence-based SciComm. And when I say evidence-based SciComm, what I'm emphasizing here is that these best practices are based on what research says is most important. First things first, know your audience. This is the absolute foundation of good SciComm. This is where it all begins, and anyone who works in science communication can tell you that without knowing your audience, you can't really quite start doing your job yet. And know your audience is thrown around a lot, but a lot of people don't quite know how to identify your audience. So we're going to break it down. So first thing when you're identifying your audience is you want to see what their beliefs and values are. And to give you an example, if you're doing a health campaign about menstruation and the country that you're working with happens to be stigmatizes menstruation due to religious beliefs or cultural values, it's a lot harder to kind of get your message out there, especially if the values are that women are viewed as the lesser sex, and this often has led to negative impacts on women's health. So a lot of the successful campaigns in countries that have these specific beliefs and values have changed the messaging to healthy menstruation equals healthy women, which is something that still aligns with strongly patriarchal cultures, but still delivers the message to the audience. Another one is that you have to consider what the prior knowledge and education of the audience is. So if you're talking to undergrads, you may still need to modify your language of your research if you're a PhD student so that they will understand. The same thing with when you're talking to people who are a non-specialist in your field, like the lay people, you need to be aiming for around grade 8 reading level because that's the average within Canada. And for Canada specifically, science literacy is about at 42%. Another thing to consider is cultural background. And so to give you an example, if I were to only use Canadian cultural references and jokes throughout a presentation, but had a predominantly international audience, then they may not necessarily understand all of them. And cultural background doesn't only include ethnic groups or racial groups. The science community as a whole can also be considered a culture as well, where there is a high demand for evidence and assertion before they believe things, as well as like the way that academia is set up, where it's kind of like a pyramid trying to get a job in tenure positions. I know that's not easy. And also because I knew that my audience for this presentation was going to be mostly science people and people from STEM, I packed as much research-based strategies to demonstrate that there is rigor to this field. Another thing to consider is motivation. What motivates your audience? And to better explain this, I have a great story for you. A friend of mine, Jen, is an environmental consultant, and she does everything she can to lower her environmental impact because she spent years in school studying climate change and its effects. Her motivation is intrinsic, and it comes from wanting to do better. Now, Jen's dad is a little more conservative, and when he found out about, and to him, climate change isn't real, it's a hoax. And when he found out about the carbon tax in Canada, he decided to install a mini wind turbine because he refused to give the government a single penny. So in this case, Jen's dad's motivation was extrinsic. It was a lot of spite and also economic. Now, one thing that a lot of the times that we often forget to consider is barriers to learning. So what kind of barriers may your audience might face? An example for this would be sex education. Sex education often has a lot of stigma, a lack of access to resources, and sometimes they're up against education policies that can be regressive, and it could also just be in general an accessibility thing as well. And lastly, why is the audience there? Are they there because they want to learn something? Are they there because they were dragged into having fun at a science center? Or are they there because they just want to have fun? So when it comes to identifying your audience, it's important to consider some of these factors. And these factors aren't the only factors that you need to think about. There are other factors that you may need to consider as well when you are putting together a SciComm event, when you are communicating science. So our first exercise, we're gonna go and kind of like fill this out ourselves. So people can, please feel free to use the chat. So we're going to start with the first one, beliefs and values. Beliefs and values. What do you think are the beliefs and values of people that are currently in this session today? Don't feel shy. There are no wrong answers. Informed decision making, yeah, it's a great one. One I also think about is that science needs to be shared. People that are committed to open science, yeah, that's a great one. Truth seeking, inclusivity, equality. Yeah, science is for everyone. Evidence-based conclusions, social justice. Yeah, these are great. This is like a lot of the values that a lot of people in STEM hold. People think that science is important and it needs to be shared with everyone so that they can make informed decisions for equitable and equality purposes. What about, what do you think the prior knowledge and education of people here are on SciComm specifically? Oh, I can repeat that. What do you think the prior knowledge and education of our current audience is when it comes to science communication? Limited training outside of basic principles, yeah. Science degree. So I noticed when we were initially doing the thumbs up poll, it seemed to be quite a bit of a mixed bag as well. Yeah, very low. Audience have less awareness. Volunteer experience with limited formal training. Yeah, that's a big one. Okay, what about the cultural background of our audience? Everyone trying to learn but not sure where to get resources. Yeah, I know Islam. That's like a challenge right now in the field. Varied, yeah. Culture, multicultural, very broad. Yeah, I noticed that with the self-introductions. There's a lot of, is international. Cultural background would also be scientists as well. Right. Okay. What about motivations? What motivated you to come today to today's workshop? Gain more knowledge, curiosity, passion about science, be a better science communicator, how to make it more accessible, education, yeah. Future career, it's a fun career. Oh, oops. And what may be some barriers? And I can kind of jump in on this too. So I know one of the barriers going into SciComm training with scientists is that a lot of scientists can struggle with the idea that the social sciences have rigor within the field, as well as a lot of scientists sometimes don't necessarily value the social sciences. So trying to ensure to frame it in a way that it's useful. So knowledge transparency to audiences. Yeah. Like a buy-in from scientists. Yeah, that's a big one. Finances. Yeah, finances is definitely a big one because not everyone has the money to do a SciComm degree. And another thing is like there's jargon within the field. Jargon is often a huge barrier when it comes to communicating your research. Okay, last one. Why are you here? Some scientists, it's not their job. Yeah, I agree with you, Esther. Why are you here? You learn about the basics of SciComm. Yeah, learn more about SciComm. I know someone mentioned earlier curiosity, part of my job. I'm sorry for making you stay here, Sanjay. Share techniques and best practices. Yeah, interaction, learn something new. These are amazing. Thank you. Oh my God, Victoria, thank you. I'm so flattered. So we're going to continue. And I know when we often misuse the term general public, and I've also mentioned it a couple of times as well, but the general public is actually composed of several publics. And let me break this down for you. I know there were some attendees from the US, and this is a study done by the Yale Climate Change Research Place, and they managed to break down America's opinions about climate change into 6 different groups. So these are the 6 different publics that exist within the climate change discourse. As you can see, there's a spectrum from alarmed to dismissive. And oftentimes, dismissive and doubtful are people that you're never going to quite persuade because they've already made up their mind and they're not open to discussion. Whereas talking to the alarmed and concerned are people who often you're preaching to the choir at that point. So the people that you want to focus on are often in the middle here, who are unsure and on the fence and don't quite know enough information to make an informed decision. And this is a great figure on how this is often the case for a lot of contentious issues, including vaccines and nuclear energy as well. And one last thing I want you to walk away with remembering when it comes to your audience is that your audience is a lot smarter than you think. We need to trust them to make informed decisions. And how do we get them to do that? It's our job as communicators to bridge that gap between science and society so that they have the tools to make those decisions. Next up. So one of the next things you want to do after you've identified your audience is to set a goal. And this is so that you can help evaluate whether or not you're successful. There are a lot of ways to evaluate how to establish a goal. And one of the easiest ways I kind of share is using the 5 W's and how. That's always a great starting point. You may not end up answering every single question here, and this is just a guideline, so it's not a hard and set rule. But I do want to take a moment and focus on the why of SciComm. Many of us, including myself, at one point, usually think that the goal of SciComm is to inform and educate people. And you're right, that is a huge part of it. But your goal could also just be to inspire people to make a change or a call to action. Maybe it's to just engage or entertain or encourage people to go into STEM. So SciComm is, education is a huge part of it, but there's so much more to it as well. And I really do encourage people to think a lot bigger. So after that, you've identified your audience and you've set your goal. This is where you get to pick your medium. And there, like I mentioned in the brief history to SciComm, there is a wide range of mediums you can select from. And that's what's great about this field. It allows you to combine both creativity and science together. So crafting your message is the next thing. We figured out our audience, what you want to achieve, what medium you want to use. This is where you start putting your content together. And I know for a lot of us, condensing all your scientific research into just a couple of things is immensely challenging. So this is adapted from the Compass message box. And this is an exercise to kind of help you break down your research into the absolute key points. So the issue and topic in the middle here is where you would write down what you're working on. Problems over here is what dimension of the issue are you trying to address? Solutions are what can be done, how are we going to address this? Benefits of solving the problem would be long-term, short-term benefits of solving the problem that you're addressing. And lastly, so what? And so what is so important because if you don't give a reason for people to care, they're going to forget about what you're talking about. So why does this matter? Why should the audience value this? What are the impacts? And most of all, why should they care? And if you do, the Compass website actually has a very detailed breakdown of it, so I do recommend checking that out. So let's do an exercise. We're going to, so the audience is scientists, including science students, which is who we have today. And the topic is going to be SciComm training for scientists. So first up, what is the current problem with maybe the availability of SciComm training or accessibility of SciComm training for scientists right now? I'm just going to give people a moment to think about it and share their thoughts. Accessibility, yeah. Lack of knowledge where to start, that's a big one. Yeah, sometimes it's time. You're right, Henry. It's time and commitment. I also wrote down that sometimes graduate students are too busy. Science, yeah, some people don't see the value in it. That's one point I wrote down. Content, not considered important enough. Sometimes it is difficult to find interactive platforms. It does take a lot of research. Ways to reach the intermediate audience. Yeah. So those are great answers, everyone. What about solutions? What could we do to solve this problem? I'm going to give people a little bit to think about this too. Promote SciComm work within universities, yeah. So I know one thing is that some universities have started to do SciComm courses. Yeah, I'm sorry, Esther, that's rough. To reach the public. Compulsory training from the beginning, yeah. So kind of like incorporating or at least asking the faculty or department to set aside a little bit of money to bring someone in to train people, internships, yeah. Okay, so what would be the benefits of having SciComm training for scientists? More outreach activities. Another thing with the benefit is that knowledge translation and mobilization is actually really sexy on grant applications right now, especially in Canada. So if you want that dollar bill, it's something you do need to incorporate into your grants lately. So better communicate and affect public opinion, which can be turned to public policy. Yeah, those are great. More informed decisions by the general public. Yeah. Losing the halo of mystery about science. Yeah. Reduced rift between STEM and social sciences. Yeah, a lot of things and projects are now moving towards interdisciplinary collaborations, so recognition among general public. Yeah. Okay. So what? Why is this important? I know this one's a little hard. What I've recognized after working with scientists and doctors, because I've trained them one-on-one, I found that people inherently want to share what they're doing. Yeah, help you realize the scope of your research. Oh, yeah. Realize the scope of your research impact. More individuals to be interested in science. Making science accessible. Gain traction, build personal profile. Yeah. I think another one is that it also helps with connecting public, media, government, and industry together as well. Yeah, the science isn't leaving the lab. What are we doing? Awareness. Yeah, those are amazing. Thank you so much for everyone for engaging. So once you've kind of figured out all the main points of your research, this is where you come up with key messaging. And key messaging is kind of like your thesis statement for those who have had the joy of writing dissertations. The key messages are the takeaway message that you want your audience to walk away with. It has two components. What is your main point? Why is this important? And that makes a key message. And the reason why this is important is like what you do is once you have your information and you've identified what message you want your audience to walk away with, this is where you can kind of build up your talk from that. And key messaging is quite even challenging for professionals to nail down as well. So let me share a trick with you that my SciComm profs have taught me. Try summarizing your topic in 5 sentences, and then 3, and then 1. I know. Imagine that. condensing your research into one sentence. It's intense. And oftentimes you are allowed to have more than one key message in your SciComm talk or event that you're doing. But I would strongly recommend to limit yourself to maybe 3 to 5, because if you do beyond that, people aren't going to remember what it is. And this is also, if you find that it's too hard to condense your research into 5, 3, 1 sentences, what I would recommend is try taking a fairy tale and doing that. It's actually quite challenging, but it's a lot of fun, and it's a great exercise on learning how to pare down all the extraneous details that the audience may not necessarily need. So now that you have all your key points and your key messaging, what do? You use storytelling. This is one of the most important tools that you'll use for communicating science. Having a narrative, which is how content is organized into logical order with context, it helps give your presentation or your talk or project structure, and it makes it engaging. You may not notice it all the time, but narrative is also in good science as well. How many are you familiar with IMRAD? If you don't know, it's totally okay. Heard it once, okay. Okay. Use it all the day, all every day, yes, yeah. So some people are familiar. I didn't know about it until someone showed me. So IMRAD is just an acronym for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. So even within journal articles, there is a narrative, and I'm going to break it down one step further. So beginning is introduction, methods, results is the middle, and discussion is the end. Just like how stories have, well, most stories have a beginning, middle, and end. And because, I could go on forever about storytelling, I'm going to pull one technique that a lot of storytelling mode that science often uses, and it's called the ABT storytelling. It's the and, but, therefore. So, and is the setup, but introduces a conflict or a problem. And then therefore provides a solution. It kind of gives the audience closure. So here you're providing a background, and then you're setting up to present what your research question is, which is the but, and then you provide the solution or closure for the people who are attending your talk or event with the therefore. It doesn't have to necessarily fit into one sentence, and the words and, but, and therefore won't necessarily be used all the time, but this is often the basic structure you want to give when it comes to giving narrative to an engaging talk. But most of all, this sounds artsy-fartsy, Kian. Why should I care about this? Well, when it comes to using storytelling, research has shown that people remember things better when there is a narrative, and they compared brain activity between people who watch the video with a storyline compared to just, e-clip. It's just birds flying and people walking. It's just like 20 minutes of that. So it's important to kind of put in that extra effort of ensuring that your audience can follow along by telling them a story about your research. And if you do want to read a lot more about this, Houston, we have a narrative by Randy Olson. It's a fantastic book to read. I do really recommend picking it up. He used to be a PhD researcher / professor, and then he ended up going into the film industry. So he's great at being able to speak both languages from the arts and from the sciences. So next up, let's say you have a rather contentious issue, or maybe you just need to kind of spin your story in a certain way so that you can it's easier for people to kind of quite consume what you're trying to communicate. And this is where you would do something called framing. So, but before, I have another activity for us. Oh, I think someone's mic's on. That's weird. Okay.
Just trying to find who it is, Dr. Mute.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to show you a word, and I want everyone to yell out, well, I guess type out the first thing that pops up into their head. Bam. Don't be shy. Just gonna open the chat. Vaccines, cancer, virus. I always notice with the STEM communities, they lean towards science. Virus, yeah. Is it because I put human papillomavirus? Am I priming people? vaccine. Okay, okay, cool. So the reason why we think vaccine is because of SciComm. Oh. So when it came to the HPV vaccine, the biggest concern of many parents was that teens would go out and have orgies, since this vaccine would make them invincible to all STDs, which I remember this being an issue when I was in high school. Research has proven that it's not. But there were also other parents, including my mother and my friend's mom, who was a nurse, who saw the HPV vaccine as a vaccine to protect against cancer. So over the last decade or so, how have we approached encouraging people to take the HPV vaccine? This is where framing comes in. And framing is emphasizing certain parts of an issue to show a specific perspective on it. And if the people are interested more about framing, I did my entire master's research on this, just like reach out to me and we can talk about it. And the specific example I have here is what the CDC did. And they used the messaging, HPV is cancer prevention. They didn't even give breathing room for people to question whether or not this was associated with STDs. It's just a fact here. It's written as a fact, and the framing that they used and the approach that they used here was strictly focusing on the benefits of vaccinating, which is cancer prevention. HPV vaccine is a vaccine for cancer. And what has happened in the last 15, 20 years? In February 2020, they found that cervical cancer will be eliminated by 2040 in Canada and in the next century, over the next internationally. This is what excellent, effective science communication can achieve. Yes, science was what made it possible, but if we didn't quite bridge that gap between science and society, it might have taken a lot longer than this. But I know one of the biggest things that people ask me is, well, what if my research is really complicated? Like what are other things I can do to help people understand what I do a little easier? So aside from storytelling and framing, using accessible language is the next best thing you can do to help achieve your SciComm goals. And as we mentioned earlier, the use of jargon is a barrier. And it was a study that came out earlier in 2020, where the researchers found that the use of jargon disrupts an individual's understanding of science content, even when the term was defined. They also found that jargon made readers feel unqualified to discuss science-related topics and that they just weren't good at science. So this is where you have problems with having more public engagement when it comes to evidence-informed decisions. So my general rule is that if I need to reread something twice, it means that it needs to be rewritten. Part of our jobs as science communicators is to make it easy for the audience to understand what you're saying. And my prof once told us, it is our job to do the heavy lifting for the audience. And now that you're here, please never use the words dumbing it down ever again, because when you're using dumbing it down as a phrase, you're implying that the audience is too stupid to understand what you're trying to communicate. If every single person in the public had a PhD in STEM, then you wouldn't have to change your language, but how many of us are experts in car mechanics or in the medical field? We're not. So to say that you're dumbing it down is often the reason why the public perceives the STEM community and scientists as being in this ivory tower and elitist, which was a survey that they did in Canada. And also, no one feels good being treated like they're stupid or being talked down to. If you make someone feel really smart, you actually feel really proud of yourself. So takeaway message from here is simple is sexy. There's nothing wrong with that. But I do know sometimes there are incredibly difficult concepts and theories. So what do you do then? That's when you use analogies and metaphors. And it does take a little bit of time to develop these, but once you have your analogy or metaphor for whatever research project you're working on, you'll use that for the rest of your degree or project. And to show you my point, we're going to do another exercise, and I want you to type out the answer. The mitochondria is the blank of the cell. Powerhouse, yes. Amazing. It is, everyone's correct. I know the next one, some people get a little stumped on, so let's see if we can get it. DNA is the blank of life. Essence, okay. Building block, molecule, ladder, backbone. Blueprint. Henry got it. It's the blueprint of life. These are things we learned in high school, but they've still stuck with us. That's how powerful analogies and metaphors can be. I did have one person tell me mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell has essentially become a meme today though. So I'm like, oh, it's fine. It still works. So now that you've done all of this, what do you do after? You evaluate your success. And this is to establish whether or not you've achieved what you set out to do, and also how to improve next time. So some ways to evaluate your success is through surveys or questionnaires, observations of how someone is interacted with your exhibit if you work in museums, social media statistics, number of attendees, and like, did people have fun? If you are going to do surveys and questionnaires, I do recommend bringing in someone who does them in their research, because they're a lot trickier than they let on. Now, what are some other takeaway tips I want to give you when it comes to doing SciComm? First is build trust and credibility. This is something that does take a lot of time and patience, but it's important to kind of be open-minded without having a judgmental tone. And that kind of leads into being able to always be listened and open to conversation. A lot of the times, a lot of people think SciComm is about talking at people, but it's about fostering a dialogue and having a conversation with people. And that's how you correct myths, and that's how you introduce more information. Another thing is be careful not to other people. I'm not able to go into the best practices of debunking myths as well as research on misinformation, because that's a whole talk in itself. But one of the things that often happens when people are doing science communication is that sometimes they get a little frustrated, and then you start yelling at people and you tell people, if you don't believe that, you're dumb and you don't know things. So it's always important to practice empathy when it comes to doing science communication. And lastly, why does any of this matter? Well, sharing is a part of science. Having science dialogue and discourse is so important to democracy. And it also minimizes misinformation, which we know this year has been rough. And as the UN has declared, it is an infodemic. And lastly, engaging with the public leads to support to your research. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of grant funding bodies are more keen on giving money to researchers who are doing knowledge mobilization and dissemination. And yeah, that's it for me.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was really insightful. That was brilliant. Yeah, a fantastic presentation. So many people getting involved and being interactive. Yeah, I've never experienced something like that in our virtual networking event so far, in that style of presentation. And now I'm feeling like it's something that I'm going to try and get everyone. No, it's fantastic. Does anybody have any questions? Conscious of the time, I know we can run a little bit over.
Yeah, I'm okay to stick around for a bit. I'm really sorry. I didn't realize there was going to be like an introduction section with everyone sharing. So
No, not at all, not at all.
Yeah.
It's testament to yourself how many people have come, and I didn't want to stop the presentation at any point. I thought it probably answered most questions that people would have anyway.
Yeah.
If anyone knows how to use, well, obviously you know how to use Zoom a little bit, but on the participants list, there's a button where at the bottom you can raise your or lower your hand. I can see Islam's done it already. So if we just use that function for who wants to ask questions, so I can see who's available, and then I'll just say a name without being a bit of a teacher about it. So Islam, do you want to ask your question?
Hey Kim, that was a great presentation.
Hi.
Yeah, so I have a question on why is this important? Like, why should we care? So, for example, recently there was discovery of the gravitational waves, discovery of black hole, picture of black hole. A lot of people come and ask me, why are you putting so much money into this? Why is it important? Why should we even care about this? So, unless it's like, let's do it to medicine, to health treatment, or something that impacts you directly, it's very difficult to actually at least start a conversation on why people should care. So how do we tackle things like that?
Yeah, so one of my friends actually works in Snow Lab, which for physics, and I know we've had a lot of discussions at length about fundamental science and applicable science. So medicine and things like that are like applicable science, but like you mentioned, when you're talking about black holes and stuff, that is fundamental science. And I think the best way you could probably explain that to someone is trying to explain understanding the basic building blocks of how a certain field works helps us later apply that to everyday things. So it's kind of like, it's like what you're essentially doing is you're trying to identify kind of like the structure of a DNA or amino acids and things like that, correct? So I think it's also that we need to kind of take the time to explain to the audience. And I know like even for in life sciences compared like versus like physics, even life sciences, like I don't know what this is, what. It's like important to kind of emphasize the whole role of not every single thing about science has to be about humans. It doesn't always have to be about us. Sometimes it's just about understanding. Because I also know a lot of my profs who are doing research with like environment or animals as well, like that may not necessarily ever have anything to do with humans, but at the end of the day, curiosity is driven, it drives science as well. So I think emphasizing the
but general public, when you say, we have a new cure for cancer, everyone's going to read that. There's something when you have the word cancer, then people get excited because they know, or
it's
HIV and things
home.
like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with the meteor showers this year, and as well as the Neowise comment, everyone was very engaged in that too. Yeah. I do sympathize with you. I do know what you're trying to say. Yeah. So if you go on, Callum.
No, sorry. I was just waiting. I thought you'd finished.
Oh, yeah. That's the best answer I have.
No, that's great. Esther, you had your hand.
Yes. So my question is, when you're giving a seminar or a webinar like we are today, and you can't assess your audience or you know nothing about them, how do you go about it? Because every single SciComm training, presentation, course that I've been to, first is always know your audience, but what happens when you can't know your audience?
Yeah, so if that's the case, I would, if you're an invited speaker, I would talk to the organizers and ask them typically who attends this and typically like what is your target audience as well. So knowing your audience is one thing, but if there's a specific target audience that they're aiming for, you want to kind of cater your content to that as well. And also, let's say they're not quite sure, what you can do is once they register, you can ask them to kind of like pull a very light demographic report just to like let you know what the age range is, maybe like what the educational background of the people are, so that then again, you can kind of modify your content as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Abhijit?
Hi, I'm not sure. I feel like this is a stupid question, but
oh my gosh, no such thing.
But I was wondering whether you could tell me a little bit more about how I can practice science communication, particularly as like an undergraduate student who doesn't have their own research so far. I'm not exactly sure how I can practice and make myself more accessible.
Yeah. So what would you want to do? Is there like something like what is there like a goal? Is there a certain medium you want to use?
Not really. I just want to make science more accessible and inclusive.
Okay. So what you could start with is taking very commonly believed myths and debunking those.
Okay.
You do have to be careful with that. I do recommend looking up the Debunking Handbook by Lewandowski. It's from 2011 or 2012, but one thing I do want to warn, if people are going to look into this, do not buy into the backfire effect, because that has been very hard to replicate. So it happens in very obscure cases. So for people who aren't familiar with it, the backfire effect is when you are trying to debunk information that is closely tied to people's beliefs or values. they are more likely to buckle down and ignore the evidence. And I know that there are a lot of extreme cases that we've seen this often, but generally debunking is beneficial because that group, again, is like the very, very far to the side kind of audience public that aren't going to change their minds at all from the beginning. But just be wary of the backfire effect there. And I know the easiest entryway for a lot of people is social media, because that's something you can do from the comfort of your home, and you kind of have to right now. Outreach as well, if you want to try volunteering at science centers as well, that's a great way to start as well.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
That's great. I don't think, I've got 2 pages of participants. I don't think anyone else has their hand. So if anyone's got any final questions, now's your time in the next 5 to 10 seconds to put it up. But whilst you're doing that, I'm not sure if everybody saw in the chat, as people started to leave, I put a small message in, but something that very much links to, we'll go for one question.
2 questions.
Hang on a minute. 2 participants raised hand. Hassan, of course it was you. Go on, ask your question.
Cheers. Yeah, quick one. I just wanted to know, for example, what would be the best way to talk about science communication? So I'm really great at talking about my research, apart from Twitter and all that. What I see is like a lot of researchers just follow each other, and they're within that community. So like they use the jargon and those complicated language. But what is the best way to reach out to the public apart from through the media?
That's a challenge that a lot of us have been facing as well. I know, depending on who you want to reach. So you can actually break down audiences within social media. Facebook is the most representative of the population. So if you want to go for a wider range of people, usually Facebook is a good place to go. Twitter is probably the most privileged audience, where majority of the people have university education. They're usually between the ages of 19 to 40. So they're like highly educated, also like very wealthy. So that's another thing. And then Instagram is like mostly younger people who are the Gen Zers, as well as with TikTok as well. But if you want to leap outside of social media, I think collaborating with institutions that already have an established audience, such as science centers or schools, is a great place to start. I've been asked in the past, how do you reach the people that need this science and need this knowledge, but you can't tap into them? That's something that my colleagues and I have talked at length about. And I think in terms of things like that, if you're putting an event together, it needs to kind of go back to the whole beliefs and values thing. So if you're putting something together about environmental practices, you would have to frame that as in like how to save money when it comes to greening your house, and kind of avoiding the terminology that I guess the people who already know what is good for what is like best practice would be. And for those people as well, I think kind of like tapping into those community networks that already exist is probably the easiest way to start, because trying to start from scratch and building your audience is in itself very challenging. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah.
Okay.
And we have one more question from Nikita. This is the last question.
Yes, thanks so much for your talk. I think kind of jumping off of what Hassan was saying, one of the issues I've been finding is trying to convince the older academics, since most of us are in institutions at the moment, to kind of be mindful of how they are conveying their messages. And not only is it important to transfer, but you need to translate, like you said, with your audience in mind, and not just be stuck in the rut of like doing things as you've always done, since so much has changed with how we communicate these days. So any thoughts about that?
Okay, so from my experience with working with profs, there are people who will never change their mind, and that's not your fault. And your energy is worth investing in someone who is open to, or is open to kind of moving towards being better at communicating their research. I know it's like is not the answer that a lot of people want to hear, but once they realize their other colleagues are doing all this SciComm and getting all this attention, they're like, oh, maybe I should try it. Other than that, what I found was that if you can't bring someone from 0 all the way to 100, you just bring them incrementally. So maybe they go from 0 to 10, 10 to 20. So it's like taking these like baby steps. So there have been times when I was working one-on-one with students, and I got a lot of pushback for a lot of the things that I kind of like talked about. And they're just like, oh, but you're just making the slides look pretty. And I'm like, no, I'm actually giving your entire talk structure. 2 of my students actually placed in our competition. So I was like, so it's, you can only bring the horse to the water. You can't force it to drink it. So if they're open to like certain changes or certain feedback, then absolutely, that's fantastic. But you may not be able to get them to do everything, and that's not your fault. So it's a little, I know it's a little discouraging, but that's where we're all at for a lot of us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. So we're done with the questions. Apologies. If anybody else has anything to ask, then first of all, the recording will be available on the video section of the Scientistt platform in case there's anything that you want to go back over, or feel free to connect with everyone in this session. And you can ask more questions that way. I see that we've had plenty of different links. Just to finish then for a minute or two, something that we also do at Scientistt is something called Scientistt Studio, where we put together animated videos of people's research topics or campaigns or things that they're working on, sort of as a method to aid you in public engagement and getting more people involved with your science. So rather than have to read a full research paper that perhaps includes things like jargon or things that, or they don't have the educational background necessarily to do that sort of thing, we put together 1-minute video clips, sort of cartoon drawn style of things. So if that's something that you're interested in, I did put a discount code in the chat box, but on the Scientistt platform it's available as well for you to be able to see, and you can place orders that way. Or likewise, if you are working on something like a non-profit or anything like that where budgets and things are an issue, get in touch with us via Twitter, and we're always looking to collaborate with things like that and help people out with making things. We're recently doing one for a postgraduate conference in the UK, which, because it's free, they don't sort of have things to throw everywhere. So we're helping out with things like that. So feel free to do that. But as I said, it's been a fantastic session. I'm very pleased with how it went. Hopefully everybody took at least one thing away from it. If you haven't already, please do join the Scientistt platform. It's completely free to join and become a member, and you can connect with people that, like you've met today, sort of whenever you want. You're not just limited to 1 hour a week. And likewise, follow us on Twitter, and you can see future events and things like that. Next week's event, which again will be 4 p.m. UK time, is about mental health in academia. So we have a guest tying in with who's recently come on the podcast, who'll be speaking about her own experiences, and then an organisation that she set up, Dragonfly Mental Health, I think it's called, which now has over 100 volunteers from 25 different countries and things like that, trying to tackle different aspects of mental health in academia and provide resources and things like that. So on Monday at the latest, that event will go live, so you can sign up to that one. But yeah, it's been great to have everyone. I can see all of the nice messages flooding in. You'll have to quickly screenshot so you've got testimonials of how well it went. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for the messages and things like that. And yeah, feel free to get in touch with us if you need anything. But apart from that, Hassan, do you have any final things?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks again, Aki. It was, I think, great presentation.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks everyone as well.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Okay, I'm going to end the meeting now, so you can all do a little virtual wave and we'll go. See you later, everybody. Bye-bye.